33 of Russia's best naval warships stopped inside of a particular section of the Barents Sea for this huge military training exercise. One ship would pretend to be an enemy combatant, and the other ships would work on locking onto that ship and firing at them. They would use duds that didn't actually explode. And so around 9 a.m., the man who was in charge, Admiral Popov, authorized one of the submarines to shoot 2 of their dummy torpedoes at a target, which was actually just one of the other ships. As soon as he did this, he was authorizing the start of this multi-day long exercise. And by the following morning, Admiral Popov stepped away from the action to speak with Russian reporters on the phone. He tells them that so far, the training exercise is going exactly to plan. However, there was a problem. The family members of some of the crews that were out there, they heard a rumor that in fact, something bad had happened to one of the ships. But none of the family members had any more information beyond that. Even though this rumor was just that, a rumor, they naturally became very worried. And so they all, that morning, began calling the naval base where the 33 ships had originated, asking for more information. And the phone operator on the base at first was telling these family members, there's no issues, but eventually this phone operator let slip that in fact they too had heard the rumor, and they think it actually might be true. But when this family member who heard this pressured the phone operator for more information, the operator clammed up and said, I can't give you anything else. And so at that point, the family member hung up the phone and called the media and told them what was going on. And the media, they went right to Admiral Popov and they said, hey, can you address this rumor? And he didn't. He did not respond to any of the media's inquiries. And in a weird way, that was kind of reassuring because they're thinking, if Admiral Popov is just kind of ignoring this rumor and he's staying out there, then certainly nothing bad could have happened, right? And so for the rest of that day, the family members and the media just kind of did nothing because there wasn't anything else to do. And the following day, Russian officials would go on TV and they would address the rumor by saying, well, yeah, it is true. Something did happen out during this exercise. The Kursk, which was the name of one of the submarines, they experienced some minor technical difficulties that forced them to ground their vessel at the bottom of the Barents Sea. But don't worry, this is normal. We're in touch with them through the radio. Everybody is fine. We are pumping air and power into their submarine, and before long, we will have them back on the surface. Now, naturally, the family members of the Kursk crew specifically, they panicked when they heard this. They did not feel confident that everything was fine. Their family members are trapped on the bottom of the ocean. The Kursk was quite literally Russia's best ship. They had spared no expense on it, and it was massive. It was bigger than 2 football fields put together, and it was constructed out of this very specialized, highly reinforced steel that allowed it to take a direct hit from a torpedo and just keep on going, no problem. And so if you were going to be stuck at the bottom of the ocean inside of a submarine, you would want to be stuck inside of the Kursk. And so the families took solace in that. But over the next couple of days, despite the government reassuring everybody in the news that everything was fine, the Kursk still had not been raised to the surface. And the government was not giving the families or the media any new information. The families began to panic and the media began to speculate. Did the Kursk really suffer from minor technical difficulties like the government was saying? Or was this something more serious? This question would be answered on August 21st, 9 days after this training exercise had begun, when a Norwegian dive team, they were out there to assist in the recovery effort. They were able to dive down to the Kursk, and they actually got inside of the submarine through an escape hatch. And once these Norwegian divers got inside of the Kursk and had a look around, they were totally shocked at what they saw. While the exact details of what happened inside the Kursk are still debated today, and probably will be for some time, there is one aspect of the story that is more or less universally accepted, and that is what happened inside of compartment number 9. The Kursk was divided into 9 watertight segments called compartments, number 9 in the very back of the submarine. And the reason we know what happened inside of compartment number 9 is because a 27-year-old Kursk crew member, Dmitry Kolesnikov, told us. 4 months before this training exercise out in the Barents Sea, Dmitry met and very quickly married a high school teacher named Olga, and right after their wedding, one of the first things he did is he brought her on board the Kursk for a tour. And Olga brought along a video camera and filmed her tour through the ship, and on this video, he is so happy to be leading her around the ship. It's really obvious that Dmitry was so proud of his job. Fast forward to August 12th, 2000, and Dmitry, along with 117 other crew members on board the Kursk, had just arrived at their designated section in the Barents Sea for this training exercise. And at 11:27 a.m., the captain of the Kursk came over the radio and he told Admiral Popov, who was not on the Kursk, he was on a separate ship, he told the admiral that the Kursk was about to fire their 2 dummy torpedoes. After this call was made, the men in the first compartment of the Kursk, they began loading these 2 dummy torpedoes. Meanwhile, Dmitry was all the way back in the 7th compartment, the engine room. That was where he was stationed. Dmitry and his men, there weren't that many of them, they were twisting dials and pulling levers, when all of a sudden there's this really loud crashing sound, and then the ship shudders and then jolts hard to one side. What Dmitry and the men in the 7th compartment could not have possibly known was that one of the real torpedoes in the first compartment had malfunctioned and it exploded. But because of how well built the Kursk was, this torpedo, as advertised, did not puncture through it. It did a lot of damage and caused a massive fire, but the sub was not sinking. Dmitry, he stands up from being jostled to the ground, and the alarms are going off and everything is totally chaotic. Everyone's asking what's going on, and Dmitry, he takes charge and he tells his men to follow the emergency protocol, which was to seal the watertight doors of your compartment. And so in this case, he sealed both the doors, one leading to the 6th compartment and the other leading to the 8th compartment. As Dmitry and his men are sealing these 2 doors, they would have begun to see and smell smoke as it came in through the ventilation ducts. They also would have felt the submarine suddenly pitch upward at a very steep angle as the captain of the Kursk desperately tried to surface. But before they could reach the surface, that uncontained fire reached the other live torpedoes and it set off this almost instantaneous chain reaction of explosions. This second collective blast killed virtually everyone in the front half of the submarine. The second blast did puncture the walls. Once that hole was created, all this Arctic water began flooding into the submarine. The only people who survived the first and second explosions were anyone in the 6th compartment going backwards. And so Dmitry and the other men in the 7th compartment, they would have been very alive and very aware of the terrible situation they were in. At 11:32 a.m., just 4 minutes after that initial explosion, the Kursk slammed nose first into the ocean floor 350 feet below the surface, and then the back half of the Kursk came down to rest. What we do know is they had power, so there was light inside of the submarine. Also, the air purifiers were still working, so despite the chemicals and smoke that was in the air, it was relatively easy to breathe. During those first 2 hours, we also know that at some point, Dmitry and the other men in his compartment must have heard banging coming from the 6th compartment, and so Dmitry decided to break emergency protocol, and he opened the door to the 6th compartment to allow any of the survivors that were banging on the door to come into their compartment. And when Dmitry and his men opened that door and looked into the 6th compartment, they would have seen that it was rapidly flooding, and most likely anybody forward of that compartment, they were already dead. By 1:30 p.m., Dmitry and his men in the 7th compartment and the other survivors from the 6th compartment, they were forced to retreat into the 9th compartment because of flooding. The walls were no longer watertight because this huge explosion had sent shrapnel flying down the body of the submarine, puncturing holes in all of the walls. And so it didn't matter if you shut your watertight door. Eventually, as one compartment would fill up, it would begin leaking through all the cracks in the walls. They would have been very aware of that, and so by the time they got all the way back to the 9th compartment, the very back compartment, there was nowhere else to go. The water was going to eventually reach them, and they were doomed unless they got rescued or if they left out of the escape hatch. Despite how absolutely terrifying this situation must have been, Dmitry remained calm. In fact, he was so calm that he pulled out a piece of paper and he writes the date and time in the corner, and then he begins to kind of describe what had happened. He talks about there being an explosion, and he thought he and these 22 men were the only survivors, and he says they're now trapped in the 9th compartment and they have to wait for rescue. He also talks about how they had considered going out the escape hatch, but apparently it hadn't worked. He folded it up and put it in his pocket, and then for the next hour and a half, he sat inside of the 9th compartment with the 22 others, and the power went out, which thrust them into absolute pitch darkness. And the temperatures, because the power was out, suddenly began to plummet. And then the worst part was the water began seeping through the walls. And so Dmitri and the other men, they would have known that it's just a matter of time before this room fills completely with water and there is nowhere to go. And so with the water rising all around them, Dmitri pulls that paper back out of his pocket and he adds to the note. And this time, his handwriting is barely legible. And it's because he's probably suffering from hypothermia, so he's shaking. He can't see what he's writing. In fact, he writes the words, "I'm writing blind," to indicate it's totally dark in the room. And in this second note, Dmitri indicates that he does not think he's going to survive. It's very clear none of them think they're going to survive. Then, with the remaining space on this piece of paper, Dmitri writes this very loving and very thoughtful message to his wife and his family, saying goodbye. And then his final words on this note are, "Regards to everybody, no need to despair, Kolesnikov." After he wrote this second message on this note, he folded the paper up, put it in his pocket, and then in total darkness, listening to the sound of water rushing into the room, he and the other 22 souls prepared to die. We don't know how long Dmitri and the other 22 men survived in compartment 9, but experts say the entire Kursk submarine was completely flooded 8 hours after the initial explosion. Dmitri and these 22 other men could have potentially been saved if the Russian response was a little bit more urgent and coordinated. Despite 2 of these ships, including the ship that Admiral Popov was on, hearing and feeling the second explosion, nothing was done about it. It was reported, but no one really did anything. And then when no one could get in touch with the Kursk after they had said they were going to fire those 2 dummy torpedoes, they all just said, you know what, I'm sure it's just their radios and they're fine and they'll be in touch soon. And so it wasn't until later that evening when the Russian Navy even figured out there was a major problem with the Kursk. And then it would be several hours before they even got a rescue submersible in the water down to the Kursk. And then once it was down there, they could not latch onto the escape hatch on the submarine. And so even if there were survivors inside of the submarine, they would not have been able to exit into this rescue submersible. And so for days and days, the Russians struggled to try to get inside of the submarine and kept turning down foreign aid from Norway, from America, from Great Britain. And then finally, 9 days after the Kursk had sank, the Russians did accept foreign aid. And that's when the Norwegian dive team, they went down and they were able to open up the escape hatch. And when they went inside the submarine, they saw it was completely flooded. There were bodies floating everywhere. And that's when ultimately Dmitri's body was found and they found that note tucked in his breast pocket. Russia would go on to award the entire crew of the Kursk with the Order of Courage, which is a very significant military award. And the families of the crew of the Kursk were given 10 years salary each. They were also given free housing in any Russian city, and their children would all have their college education paid for. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.